For our very first lesson, we're going to talk about prepping characters for rigging in After Effects. And we're also going to look in a subsequent lesson how to import those files into After Effects and get ready for the rigging process. We're going to finish up talking about designing characters a little bit, which I know might seem a little bit out of order, but the truth is, this whole conversation is probably just a little bit out of order. Honestly, we really could have had this conversation at the very end of the course once you have learned a lot about rigging. Because the truth is, understanding how to design and then prep a character for rigging and animating in After Effects is going to be much more understandable once you've done a lot of rigging. And the more rigging you do, the more you'll have a good eye for things that will work and things that don't work and how to avoid trouble. But we're going to go ahead and start talking about this subject because it is chronologically where you would begin the process of rigging a character for animation. So we're going to go ahead and talk about this right now. But I want to make it clear, there's going to be a lot of stuff that is going to make much more sense as you move through the course. So look at this as a little introduction, a little taste of this topic. And I think you'll find that by the end of the course, you have a pretty good understanding of what you want to be looking for both in the design and prepping of your characters. Before we have a look at some specific examples, let's talk about a couple of basic issues that we want to think about when we're approaching prepping a character for rigging. One of the first things we need to do is understand how much we actually need to rig. In this course, we're going to be making pretty full rigs that are capable of a lot of movement. But of course, not every animation project or character requires that. You may have foreground characters that are quite active, but you may have background characters that only have just one or two simple movements. Or you may be creating a piece with several characters, but each character is only on screen for a couple of seconds, again, just performing some simple motions. And in those cases, there is no need to create an elaborate, full-fledged rig. Just want to make that really clear right up front. We're going to make some elaborate, really full rigs so that you can learn a lot about the rigging process, but you don't have to apply everything you've learned to every situation. An example of that would be this businessman character. Now, let's say, for example, that he is appearing in an infographic and he's on screen for 3 to 5 seconds, and all he has to do is look like he's talking on his cell phone. Now, there's obviously no reason in that case to build a fancy rig for his legs so he can walk. There's no need to even necessarily rig up this arm at all if all he has to do is maybe move his cell phone arm a little bit and nod his head. And since you're not building any fancy rigs for his legs or his arm, there's no need necessarily to prep all of those things if you know you're not going to use them. Now, it's always a good idea to maybe over-prep just a little to err on the side of caution in case you have a client that gets overly excited and suddenly wants the character to do something that you didn't plan for. But in general, you can have a look at those storyboards and just separate the parts you need for that particular situation. Towards the end of the course, we'll take a look at a few simple rigs for situations just like that, just to give you a few ideas. To understand how much you need to rig the character, and therefore how many layers you may need to separate, how you're going to prep the character, we want to be looking at the storyboards and the character design and the art style for our cues there. The storyboard will tell us what the character is going to have to do and in what kinds of camera angles and so forth. The design style will tell us what kind of rig is possible with the character, what type of rig might work best for that particular art style, and will also will give you an indication of what some of the limitations may be. Now, some of this, quite honestly, will come with more experience, but you can pretty easily understand that a very, very complex character that has to do a lot of movement is going to be a much more involved rig than a simple character who maybe just has to talk on a cell phone. Now, because the storyboard and the character design have such an impact over how the character is rigged and animated, it's really, really important, no matter what role you're playing on a character animation project, it's really important to try to seize as much control over those things as you possibly can and make choices that are helpful to the rigging and the animation all the way through. Now, obviously, in this business, you don't always have that perfect opportunity to control every aspect of a production, but the more control you have over the pre-production, the smoother your rigging and animating process is likely to be. We're going to be focusing on Photoshop and Illustrator for the most part in this lesson. Now, there are, of course, other options for creating the artwork for a character. We're going to focus on Photoshop and Illustrator as two of the obviously most popular choices. I also just want to touch on After Effects for just a moment. I actually do a lot of my character building directly in After Effects. Now, I'm fairly unusual in that. I think most people would argue that Illustrator is a better vector drawing tool than After Effects, and it is, because Illustrator is designed to be a vector drawing tool. After Effects is not. But the shape layers have become more and more robust in recent years, and you can do much of what you can do in Illustrator in After Effects using shape layers. And the advantage is that you immediately have access to a lot of editability, animatability, and flexibility that you don't quite get when you do an import from Illustrator into After Effects without a lot of monkeying around. So I do actually recommend using After Effects with some reservations. It has a lot of advantages, but I think a lot of people who would be comfortable vector drawing in Illustrator would probably be a little frustrated by the interface. It's not quite what it should be yet, quite honestly. It's not terribly intuitive, and the key commands and things are all a little bit different, so if you're used to Illustrator, you might find that a little bit of a difficult transition. Photoshop is going to be your choice for raster-based characters, artwork that has more texture, organic, hand-drawn styles, scans of artwork or photographs, anything like that, anything raster-based, you're going to want to use Photoshop. Let's start by taking a closer look at some prepped characters in Photoshop. You'll notice the character is placed inside a square. I like building the characters in squares for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it makes the math fairly easy, and it also creates, if you position the character a little bit lower in the square, it gives them a really nice big range of movement. The way you generally want to work in After Effects is to have a single comp for the character rig, and then you place that comp into the scene. And you're going to do most movements right inside the square, and you're only going to really move the comp like across the scene if the character has to take multiple steps or run or jump or do something really big. You're generally going to do most of your motions right in the character's rig comp. So you want to make sure that that comp has a lot of space. I like to go ahead and prep the characters ahead of time in that comp size for a couple of reasons that we'll talk about when we talk about importing into After Effects, but also so I can immediately start kind of visualizing and thinking about what the character is going to have to do and how much is it going to have to move. You want to think about things like, does the character have to hold something long and swing it around like an umbrella or a sword? Then you might need to allow a little bit of extra room for the character. Generally, you can not worry about the space underneath the character too much, although there are things that'll happen where you'll want the character to, say, reach down over a ledge or something like that. But you can generally bring them pretty close to the bottom edge. I always leave a little extra room for safety. And you'll hear me say that a lot. I tend to take a lot of steps that may not actually ever pay off in the end, but they're steps that have paid off for me in the past when I have had surprises. And I'll tell you one thing with character animation that I hate more than anything are surprises. So I tend to do a lot of stuff to make sure, like for example, the kind of over layering I was talking about, just to make sure that I've always got options. So leaving a little space in the bottom, just in case. Leaving plenty of space around the figure so that there's plenty of room to move. And this may seem like a lot of space to you, but look at how long this character's legs are. Imagine her jumping up into the air and kicking her legs out in a big karate pose. You're going to need this space to do that. So it's a really good idea to start there. If your character has to do close-ups, in other words, has to appear on camera, fairly close up to the camera, in an HD, a 1080 HD frame, you're going to need a lot of pixel depth. You're going to have a lot of ability to scale that character up so that when you get in close to that character's face, the details are sharp and you're not getting fuzzy edges and nasty looking artwork. For that reason, you have to make raster characters quite large. I actually make vector characters pretty large too. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's just take a look here at our image size. We're at 6,000 by 6,000 pixels. Now the resolution, the dots per inch, that doesn't matter to us. Everything in After Effects is 72 dots per inch. So the only thing that we're concerned about is the pixel dimensions, 6,000 by 6,000. That gives us enough pixel depth to be able to get in there for those close-ups, and that way we can do close-ups and wide shots all with one rig. Now, does this tax your processor? Yes, it does. And if you have serious limitations with your hardware, you may want to consider doing separate artwork for close-ups and do separate rigs. But the downside there is then you have to do separate, like shoulder up rigs with separate face rigs for all your close-ups. Now sometimes that's the best option, but if you can make one rig that'll do all the work, that is always a better way to go. So with a 6,000 by 6,000 pixel square, that makes our character, somewhere in the range of 3,000 pixels or something like that by maybe 1,000 pixels or so, something like that. That's a pretty good size. It gives us, I think, a good close-up in an HD frame. But do some tests if necessary with your character. Depends on the character's proportions, how big the head is, how close you have to get for close-ups, what's in the storyboard, and so forth. Have a look at the storyboard, see how close you got to get that camera, and then run some tests before you start in on your final artwork. That's very, very important. So you want to make sure that you know ahead of time before, either if you're doing the artwork yourself or you're working with an illustrator, so you can tell them how big to make the artwork. Do a few tests, try it out, and make sure that you're going to get the resolution and the pixel depth that you need. So let's have a look at the character itself and how the layers are divided. We've got a character with a lot of texture, a lot of sort of hand-drawn styles, some nice kind of charcoal texture and stuff here. So this is definitely a character that makes sense to create in Photoshop. Now, you can certainly create a character like this in Illustrator with clipping masks and so forth. But for rigging and animating, it's probably going to be a lot easier to work in Photoshop for a character of this type. Although it depends. It absolutely depends on the kind of artwork you're looking for. So the character is divided into layers, of course, and what I generally recommend, particularly when you are not entirely sure of what you are going to need from a rig, I recommend erring on the side of separating more layers rather than less. You can always pre-compose layers together in After Effects or group layers together in Photoshop. You can always throw a couple layers together if you decide you don't need the separated parts. But from years of doing this, I have run into every possible problem and surprise that you can think of. And one thing that is always a huge relief is when you, say, go into that pre-comp or that grouped artwork and you find, oh, thank goodness, those layers are separate. This edit is going to be a lot easier. And it's also important to recognize that when you get into the rigging process, it is very, very likely that you will end up back in Photoshop or Illustrator making tweaks or revisions when you run into a problem that you didn't foresee in the rigging process. So again, err on the side of more layers rather than less, and you're generally going to end up in a pretty good place. Now, that said, keep in mind the first thing we talked about. You don't need to over prep if you know that this character, for example, doesn't have to do anything but stomp her foot. You don't necessarily have to separate every part of the body for that animation. So within reason. But even within that, if you were rigging up just this leg, I would still say if all you're doing is that leg, I would divide that leg into as many layers as I could to give myself as many options as possible. And the options, the different options that I'm talking about are what we're going to learn in the upcoming lessons. So bear with me. Again, we're to some degree putting the cart before the horse here. Some of this stuff will make a lot more sense once we actually get into the rigging. So let's again look through here. Notice that all of the facial parts are all separated. That's generally very, very important. Facial rigging is very difficult and challenging. It's also the kind of thing that can have a lot of surprises. You also have to remember that your clients may throw you a surprise like, oh, gee, be great if she could take her glasses off and wipe them on her sleeve. You want to, whenever possible, have those options available to you. So keeping everything nice and separate. We're, of course, going to want to make the pupils move. We'll eventually add some mouth shapes, some mouth phonemes so that the character can speak. So you want to keep all of that stuff separate. But you even want to do things like separating the hat, the hair. We might want to do some separate rigging with the hair and so on. So in general, don't merge layers unless you have to. Now let's take a closer look in particular at our limbs, because that's a really important part of this lesson here. Now, this character and most of the characters we're going to look at are prepped for basically full jointing. So in other words, they have joint capabilities at their shoulders, their elbows, their wrists, the fingers, the balls of the feet, the ankles, the knees, and the hips, oh, and the neck, of course, are all jointable. They're all separate pieces with overlapping that can allow them to rotate once they are rigged and animated. Now, setting up a character to be jointed this way really has kind of one overarching rule. And that rule is try, whenever possible, to create circular overlaps at your joints. In particular, elbows, knees, ankles, wrists. Those in particular will give you problems if you don't make them as circular as possible. Now, not every character design and not every artwork style is going to support this. And you have to respect that character design unless you have complete control over it. If you have complete control over it, that's another matter, and then I would recommend tweaking the design so that these circular overlaps are possible. But you want to strive for these kinds of circular overlaps whenever you can. Now, this layer that I just turned on here as we began this discussion, this is our little marker layer. And I recommend doing this, actually creating little markers as guides for where you're going to put your joints. But these markers can also come in really handy once you import into After Effects, and they give you an easy object to snap to when you're setting anchor points, so you get anchor points that are right in the center of these circles. So the whole idea here is that if you have a circular overlap, I'm going to turn the markers off here, and let's go ahead and look at this in a little more detail. So if I change this blend mode to a multiply here, you can see it's a little faint, but you can see there. You can see now that's the actual overlap of this upper arm with this lower arm, and you can see that they overlap with a perfect circle. When we then put the anchor point right in the center of that circle, this joint then can swing 360 degrees, and all the way through that 360 degrees we'll have a nice, clean, rounded joint. Okay? Now, your character design may not call for a nice, clean, rounded joint. Your character design may not be able to support a perfectly circular overlap. But here's the thing. The more your overlap is circular, the greater a range of movement you will have available to you. And also remember that you don't necessarily have to have this tight wrap around the circle like we have here. You could have sort of bulging muscles around here or fat, as long as the overlap is able to contain a circle, then you're going to be okay, and you're going to get a nice looking joint through that 360 degrees. Keep in mind, though, that if you have stuff sticking out over here, for example, and I rotate this joint, that stuff is going to come up over the top of this stuff here. So it can sometimes, if you have too much other stuff going on outside of that circle, it can limit the range of motion of your joint, so your joint can't necessarily do as much as you want it to do. Now, this gets back to that thing of analyzing how much does it have to do. If it doesn't have to do that much, don't worry about it. But if you have a character that's going to be on screen for a long time and is going to have to do a lot of complex movement, you're going to want to have joints that can move as much as they possibly can. So the circular overlap is really important. Now, it's a good thing to understand that you don't have to necessarily do this in every case. So, for example, let's look at this shoulder up here. So I just turned the multiply on, and you can see we have a circle possibility here on this arm, but we have just this kind of sharp angled joint. So if we were to really quick kind of simulate what would happen here, if we were to actually joint this up, you can see that with the design style of this character, that looks fine. And it kind of resembles what happens naturally when you lift your arm up and your shoulder kind of juts out there from your body, and you get a little bit of that coming, popping out a little bit. So this really isn't a problem, particularly with this kind of cut-out style character. But some kind of characters aren't going to look right with this kind of an overlap. They're going to need more of a connection. And one example here I can show you is this orange man here. And because he's got these big, giant, thick arms and these big, thick chest here, it makes more sense for him to have more of a complete circular overlap. And there's our markers for his overlap there. So I'm going to select this arm and just really quick turn the multiply on this arm, and you can see now we actually do have a full circular overlap on that shoulder. So what this means is that as this arm rotates, and I probably won't get this exactly in the right place, but it'll be close, as that arm rotates, we still have all the meat. He's got a good connection between the muscles here and his chest moving up through the arms. And that helps to keep him more solid looking, more muscular. So in this case, having that circular overlap up in the shoulders is a little more necessary. Maybe not critical. And again, part of this comes to taste and design style and so forth. But in this case, I think we can well get away with a little bit of kind of loose jointing up in the shoulders. The hips, on the other hand, we need to be a little more careful about. Let me turn this back to normal. Because we're going to need these legs to bend quite a bit if the character is going to be able to do a lot of complicated movement. So in this case, and if we look at our markers here, you can see that we made sure those joint overlaps are well inside the pelvis here, so that once again, this joint can then move at any angle and we won't see anything sticking out. We'll keep this nice, clean little rectangular pelvis piece without having little bumps and little things sticking out all around. So you really have to think through what's going to happen when these things rotate. And it's not a bad idea to do what we're doing here. If you're unsure, just select a layer, hit the transform button, roughly place the anchor point, understanding it won't necessarily be perfect. And then you can see, okay, yeah, I can rotate this thing around and it looks good no matter where I rotate it. So doing that kind of testing as you go, a really, really good idea. Now, down here at the feet, you'll notice that we have a joint at the ball of the foot, basically separating the toes from the heel and the ankle portion of the foot. This will allow us to create very natural foot movements and heel and toe rolls that we'll look at later. And then let's also take a look here at the hand and wrist. And we've got individual fingers here so that we can pose the individual fingers. And we have a little bit of a sticky situation here that I think is worth talking about for a minute. One of the parts of this character design, which is supposed to be this kind of hipster person, is the long-sleeved flannel shirt with the big cuffs here. And that's part of the charm of the character, having this kind of oversized flannel shirt. But one of the things this does is it gives us a challenge here for rotating the hand. And what you can see here is our joint is actually above the cuff. And what we've done is we've actually combined the palm of the hand with the cuff itself. So here, let's just turn off the markers for a second here and look at this. So if I was to transform this here, and we'll put that anchor point roughly where that's going to be, you'll see that the problem is that the cuff stops the rotation. I can, of course, break it, but you can see that starts to not really look so good in terms of a joint. We're getting some kind of weird overlapping there. Maybe not the end of the world, but it's definitely not an ideal situation. So one option that you might want to look at, and I've done up an alternate set of hands over here. Let's see, this is the right, so let me turn off the right hand stuff here. Whoops. A lot of layers. Okay. All right, so here's an alternate setup that works a little better, where you have the cuff a little bit higher. The lower arm actually contains the cuff and the wrist, with an area for circular overlap between the hand and the wrist. And then the hand, which is just that piece there, sits on top. And now when we transform this, if we get that anchor point, I probably won't get it perfect, but close there. Now I have a much greater range of movement, and even as it overlaps the cuff, that has a kind of a natural look to it. So that's probably a better option from a rigging standpoint. However, when you look at the character, it's definitely not as charming. This kind of slouchy, slumpy, oversized shirt that's hanging halfway down the hand, that's part of what makes this character charming. And this is where we run into kind of a big picture idea here in rigging, which is you have to balance the functionality of the rig with the intentions of the design of the character, and to some degree the style of art of the character. Different art styles are also going to affect the choices that you make, or even the options that you have. So in this case, sure, this is a better way to rig, but this is more appropriate for who this character is. So my inclination, because in my opinion, character and story is everything. That's the thing that we are a slave to when we are doing character animation. My goal would be to rig this character as it is and not try to change the design to match the rig. Now, there are situations where a tiny, tiny little adjustment will make a rigging situation much, much easier and really doesn't affect who the character is or the fundamental design or style of the character. So in those cases, by all means, make those little tweaks if they're going to make your rigging life easier. But I would never really make an adjustment that, for lack of a better word, corrupts the design of the character. So we have a couple options here. Either we can kind of live to some degree with the limitations of this bend, and it's not necessarily the end of the world if we do that, or we could choose to puppet tool this joint rather than do separated layered joints. With the puppet tool, we would get more of a range of motion here. However, we'd also get a lot more distortion in the art, and there would be some cons with the pros. And that's going to be part of what this course is all about, looking at different ways you can rig things and when you want to apply one technique or another. So some of this will make more sense once we get in a little deeper. Now, we also, of course, need to think about, when we're thinking about layering, we also really need to think about the order that the layers are in. Oops, I'm going to turn off these alt limbs here, make sure we got everybody else on. Okay, and let's just talk through that really quick. Now, this is a front-facing character, which honestly are a little bit more rare than three-quarter or side characters, but a kind of character you're certainly going to come across. With a front-facing character, we want to think in terms of what needs to overlap what. If I pick this arm up and I move it across the body, what does it need to be in front of? And it needs to be in front of the legs. That's going to make the most sense. The torso and the face. Now, certainly there are poses and animation where you need to put a hand behind the back, and we will actually discuss rigging that will allow you to move limbs from the front to the back of a setup. But for right now, we're going to keep things simple. So we're just going to be focusing on basic layering here. And in most cases, probably 90% of the time, you're going to want this hand to be in front of the torso, in front of the face, to scratch their nose or move their glasses or bring their hand up to their mouth in a gesture or what have you. So arms basically go on top of everything. So you can see at the top here, we start with all of the arm pieces there. Okay. And then we want the head. And again, we want to think about what does the head need to overlap? Well, it needs to overlap the torso. And it needs to be underneath the arms. So it has to be over the torso, but under the arms. And so that's where that is. So there's all of the head layers there. Then we have the legs, and the legs need to be on top of the torso most of the time. Now, again, with this particular figure, it's probably unlikely you're going to bring a leg up so it covers the torso. It's probably quite unlikely. But if you did, for some reason, get that knee up high enough so it starts to cross over in front, you're going to want that leg to be in front of the torso. Generally, you're going to want the arms in front of the legs, because it would be weird if she was picking her hand up to scratch her nose and her hand went behind her leg. So you want arms on the top, and you want legs just above the torso, but underneath everything else. And then at the very, very bottom, we have the torso parts, the torso pieces. And by the way, I will always, in this course, I will always consider the neck, the chest, and the pelvis to be the torso. And we will be pre-composing these layers together once we get into After Effects. We could group them together right now, and it would make a group which will come into After Effects as a pre-composition. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. We can either group them here, or we can pre-comp them in After Effects, but we're going to combine these. But I'm not going to merge the layers together, because like I said, I don't like surprises. So if I get some surprise where I need to edit these for some reason, I want to have these layers separate. Or if I run into a situation where I do actually want to joint the torso, it's pretty rare. I generally do not joint torsos. I generally use the puppet tool for those, but those are the quote-unquote torso pieces: neck, upper body, lower body. So all that's sitting down at the bottom. Now that's in a front-facing rig here. Now let's take a look at a character that's in a 3/4 rather than a front view, because that's going to change our layering quite a bit. So here we have a hipster dude, and he's turned away from us in this 3/4 view, which is going to be the same layering as a side view, by the way. And if you think about it, if you think about a human figure turned away from you from the side, what you can think about is you can think about what is the furthest away from you, what part is the furthest away from you, and what part is the closest to you to help you work out the rigging. So let's go ahead and walk through this, and we'll do this from the bottom up. So the thing that is the furthest from us as we look at that figure turned to the side, the thing that is furthest from us is this right arm back here. So those are the bottommost layers, are those layers. Then the next thing furthest away from us is the leg. Now you might be saying, well, the torso, but it's really the leg. And if you think about the way hips attach, they actually attach to the side of our pelvis. So really the next thing up is the right leg. Then we come to the middle of the body, which is where we have our torso pieces and all of our head pieces. So that's right in the middle. Then the next thing up is the left leg. So the left leg is the next thing that sits on top of the torso and on top of the head layer. And then the very last thing, the thing that is the closest to us, is the left arm. So the left arm is the thing that is the closest to us. That is the topmost layer. And if you think about how this works now, if I lift this arm, say he's running in front of, it's going to go in front of his leg, in front of his torso, in front of his head. This arm is going to be behind all of those things in that run. This leg will be in front of this arm, but behind this leg and behind the torso and head. This leg will be in front of the torso, in front of the head, but behind this arm. So that's the kind of logic you want to use when you're layering up a side view character or a 3/4 character. Now, all of these layers that we're looking at here all have to have a name. Now, naming is actually a very, very important issue in rigging, because we're going to be using a lot of expression code in order to set up our rigs. And what things are named, what layers are named, matters very, very much in the coding process. It also matters for the internal code going on in After Effects that's merely recognizing our layers and transforming them with keyframes. So one of the things that's very important to understand about how you name your layers is that you want to name your layers in a way so that every single layer can have its own unique name. This is very, very important. You do not want to have a composition with 3 layers that are all called head. You can run into problems with coding. Even After Effects can get muddled about which layer is which. It's really, really important to make sure that every layer has its own unique name. So the naming convention that we're using for this course might give you some tips as to how you can name your own layers. One of the things you'll notice is that at the beginning of each layer name is a letter of the alphabet. These are the character letters. So this is character I. And the character that we were looking at before, this is character G. Now the idea here is that we might be combining rigs. We might have 2 different character rigs in one After Effects project. In fact, it's very likely if you have a project with more than one character in it. But those characters are going to share a lot of things in common. They're all going to have heads. They're all going to have pupils. They're all going to have fingers. So putting a little prefix on the titles that denotes which character it is a really, really important first step, so that you don't have, once again, multiple layers all called left heel. You want to make sure you have her left heel distinguished from his left heel. So we always put that little code at the beginning that says which character it is, and it can just be one letter or one number, an abbreviation, or whatever you want to do. Next, for all the items that have a left and right side, we have the L and the R for left and right. We want this to come fairly early in the name designation so we can easily spot the left items from the right items. Remember too that if you structure your naming correctly, you can use the search window here to quickly organize things. So for example, I can search by name and I can search for underscore, capital L underscore, and it'll immediately bring up all of the left-hand parts. So good naming convention is important not just to keep After Effects from getting confused, or yourself from getting confused for that matter, but it's also great for searchability both in After Effects and in Photoshop. So the L or R goes first there, and then the next thing is just a simple description of the object. That's always a good idea, just so you don't have nothing but letters and numbers, which can again get very confusing. So just a simple 1 or 2 word description of what the object is. And then if there are multiples, in the case of fingers, or later on when we have different mouth shapes for lip sync, then we simply add a number after that. So we have left finger 1, left finger 2, and so on. This is a really easy way to kind of keep your names from getting crazy long and complicated, but again, making sure that every layer has its own unique name. One of the things you may have noticed about the artwork we're using here is that there are no outlines on the character. And we should talk about outlines for a little bit, because outlines have to be addressed in a very specific way if you're dealing particularly with jointed puppets like this, where you are actually separating the limbs and rotating at that joint. And again, some of this will make more sense to you once we get a little deeper into the rigging. We also have the ability to use the puppet tool and actually bend the artwork. So we're either going to be separating art like we've been looking at here and jointing it in and rotating it to create joints, or we're going to simply bend artwork. And so when we look at, for example, a character like this character has some texture to it, so there would be some advantage in merely bending the artwork. Because when we do rotate these arms here, let's just grab one of these arms and do a little fake animation here like we've been doing as a test. Whoops, I got that anchor point way off. It snapped. The snap there. Okay. And I'll rotate that guy a little bit. I got the position a little bit off, but we'll make sure that is correct when we rig it. And you can see we've broken the artwork a little bit by rotating this joint. That stripe doesn't meet up there anymore. But the truth is, it kind of works with the funky cutout style of the character. And the pattern is subtle and sort of loosely drawn, so it really doesn't feel that off for it to be offset a little bit like that. So this character can work fine for jointing, but it'll work fine with the puppet tool too. And again, we'll take a look at all these different options and the pros and cons of all these options when we get into the actual rigging. But down here in the knees, for example, you can't even see the join there, and any of these knees here. Let's take a quick look at one of these. Oops, keep that guy from snapping. Okay, and you can see here when we don't have all that texture and stuff, that joint is invisible. So a really nice opportunity here for jointing, because you get a clean joint that has no break in the texture or pattern. Again, this would also work fine with the puppet tool if, for example, instead of getting a crisp hard joint, you wanted a soft curve or a partially soft, partially crisp curve. And we'll look at that when we get into working with the mesh and starch with the puppet tool. And what we've done here with the circular overlaps and all that careful layering works great for a character without outlines, but we have to take some extra steps for characters with outlines. So let's take a look at a version of this character, the same character, but now she's got outlines around her, and we still have all of our circular overlaps and our layering. Everything is exactly the same here. But there's one thing significant about how these joints overlap. Because here's the thing, if we just simply butted these up against one another, as soon as we start to rotate this arm, not only are we going to break the artwork of the pattern, but we're going to break the artwork of the outline. And when we do that, you're going to get odd things like bare patches where there is no outline and places where the outlines are overlapping in odd ways. It's going to make your animation look sloppy and kind of betray the style of the character when you have that kind of stuff going on. So again, another solution here would be the puppet tool, where you just bend the art. And that is certainly an option, particularly with a hand-drawn line here. But one thing to be aware of with the puppet tool is that it tends to wrinkle and distort the line, which again can work just fine with a naturally distorted line that is hand-drawn, that has some natural thick and thin and is not perfect. That tends to kind of work a little bit better when the puppet tool distorts it. However, if you're working with a clean vector character, and we'll look at that once we move into Illustrator, the clean vector characters, it really distorts the line quite a bit, and it kind of breaks that clean vector look that we want to get. So in the case of having outlines and doing jointing, where you actually separate the joints, there is a trick that can make this actually work pretty well. So let's take a look at how this is set up. Okay, so looking at the right upper and lower arm here, we'll kind of get in close and look at this. First off, let's just have a quick look at the kind of overlap we have here. You can see we have our circular overlap, but what's not as apparent with this multiply on, let's actually turn these on and off, is that we've got a very specific way we're doing the outlines. So on this upper arm here, you can see that the outline, it wraps right around the bottom of the elbow there. And then you'll see we have a different setup on the lower arm that's sitting in front of the upper arm. The layer on top has the line stop and then just fill, making part of the circle, half of the circle, and then the line begins on the other side. And then that sits on top, once again, of outline all the way around. And what happens is when you joint this, again, kind of guesstimate here a little bit. When you joint this, what happens is, and if you get your anchor point just right, what happens is the line wraps around that elbow underneath there, and then it picks up the edge of that line coming forward on the lower arm and keeps the line consistent. And then you get a little overlap on the top here, but that overlap looks fairly natural in terms of the way that you would actually draw that by putting a little bit of the line inside to show the wrinkle of the shirt there. So that's working really nice, and we haven't spoiled the look of the character, and we still have our outline. Plus we have that crisp joint that you get with actually separating the parts and rotating rather than using the puppet tool. Now shoulders can be trickier. If you try to leave a gap in the line as you rotate the arm up, that gap will swing out and it'll cause a bare patch in the arm. Our solution here is to have the character designed so that there's outline wrapping all the way around the shoulder, so as these rotate they'll always be outlined. If you don't have the opportunity for that design choice, this is going to be a trickier situation. But with very careful tweaking, you can make a hole that'll give you a pretty wide range of motion. Another potential solution is to put small pieces of artwork that sit on top of the arm layers, but are connected through rigging to the torso, so they move with the torso, and actually just cover up little bits of the line, and then they stay where they are as the arm moves. That's another option. Another option is to design the character so the arms can sit behind the torso although honestly that really limits what the arm can do. Although you can have the upper arm behind the torso and the lower arm in front of the torso, that can sometimes work. But again, it's going to limit your range of movement. And that's something that you're going to hear us talk about quite a bit. And it's something that you have to think about a lot as you're rigging, that different choices you make are going to give you different pros and cons. And one of the things that you're going to be sort of trading on and sort of buying and selling is how much movement can you get out of a particular joint or a particular rig setup. Is it going to limit your range of motion but gain you nicer looking art? Or are you going to extend the range of motion but then run into more problems with your artwork? There's a lot of give and take with all of this stuff. It's partly why we designed this course to have a lot of different types of characters and a lot of different rigging styles and techniques, so that you can hopefully find a solution to the individual issue that you're running into. Now, continuing on with this outline rig, we also want to pay close attention to what's happening in the pelvis. One of the things we had that was really nice about this was that once again we have just color on color with no outline and no texture. So all we really had to do is just create that circular overlap there, and we have a nice free swinging joint with no problem. But here we've got a tricky situation where, once again, just like we were looking at on these arms, we want to try to keep the look of the outline consistent all the way along, but we also want a fairly large range of motion. So let's take a look at these legs here really quick. And we'll just do, once again, a kind of fake animation here. And you can see that we're getting that. We're getting a pretty good, I should zoom in here a little bit. We're getting a pretty good look, and it's got a pretty good range of motion, although I'm seeing a little problem up there. This is using the same technique that we were looking at before, where the layer on top, the lines stop, and then there's a little bump with the fill, and that is laid over the top of the pelvis piece, which is outlined all the way around. But again, we're seeing a little issue there. When we rotate it this particular direction that we're doing here, that circular overlap is now invading on that outline. Now, it doesn't look too bad, but it's a little bit of a mess, and it doesn't look as clean as it could look. So probably once we get into rigging, we'll probably just pull that back with a mask. It's not worth editing now. It's going to be much better to wait until we get into After Effects, we get our anchor points in the right place, and test things out in a more real setting that we'll figure out what we need to edit, and we'll make adjustments at that time. So this is good enough for now, but you can see the idea that for the most part, we're getting a nice range of motion that looks good from just about every angle. We've got the same outline setup happening down here with the knees, where the layer that's on the bottom has the outline wrapped all around, and the layer on the top has line just right up to the circular overlap, and then just fill, completing that circle. The heels here, just to note these really quick, these work on kind of a similar idea, but it's a little simpler. Zoom in here a little bit. You'll see here that when we rotate at that ankle with the outline wrapped all the way around, so that as I rotate this, once again, we always have that line complete. And we have a very similar setup here with the heel and toe. One thing that you want to consider is that a thicker hand-drawn line is going to be much more forgiving than a very thin, sort of spindly line, or an extremely crisp vector line. In those cases, you're going to have to be a lot more precise. There's going to have to be a lot more care and precision in how you create the artwork, and then how you place your anchor points and rig it. Okay, so let's take a look at some other characters with some different art styles that have been prepped in Photoshop, and take a look at some of the similarities and differences. let's first take a look at a simpler, kind of more abstracted character. This little lady right here, this little orange lady, you can see is very organic, kind of a sketchy, loose kind of character. Now, if you recall, I talked about sort of over layering to a certain degree and kind of erring on the side of more layering than you may need. But as soon as I saw this character, I knew that I was not going to want to try to do an actual joint in the elbows or in the knees. The design style of this character, even the gesture that the arms are already in, just beg for this character to be more rubber hosey, more rounded, soft curves at the joints is going to make a lot more sense for a character of this style and feel a lot more appropriate. So for sure, these arms and these legs are going to be created with the puppet tool. So these are not separated at the joints. And we also could be a little bit looser about our circular overlaps. They still should be there, but with a character with this loose, sketchy style, even the circles can be a little loose and sketchy, but they're still going to give us a nice range of motion. And the funkiness of having these not be perfect circles will kind of fit with the sort of funkiness of the character style. You can see that we've got joints at the shoulders, at the hips, at the wrists, and then the fingers. And the individual fingers are not individually separated. They're just a single piece there, but they'll still work really nicely for creating nice expressive movement with the character. And we'll look at some different ways we can rig these up. Now, looking at the feet here just for a moment, you'll see that the legs are separated so that the tops of the boots are actually part of the leg, and the circular overlap happens between the top of the boot and the heel. This means that we're going to do a puppet tool here for this part, but we're going to do a joint right here because it would be very, very hard to get the puppet tool to unbend this heel without massively distorting this artwork. So if we want this foot to have a nice range of motion, we can't do the puppet tool down here, but we really want to do it up here with this flexible leg. So this part here, down here, is jointed. And of course it's jointed here at the hip too. And I say of course because I pretty much always joint shoulders and hips or pelvis, pretty much always, again for range of motion. Now, there are situations where you would not do that, and we'll talk about those as well. But generally, whenever possible, I'm going to try to separate those out and joint those, even if most of the rest of the rig is puppet tooled. So in this case, we're going to be combining some puppet tooling and some jointing. So we're going to have these hands jointed, and the shoulders, but the arms will be a puppet tool, legs will be a puppet tool, hips and ankles will be jointed, and the toes and heel too, although we'll probably look at what happens when we do both, because the feet could go both ways, and there would be pros and cons with doing the feet. So we'll talk about all that stuff when we get a little deeper in. Now notice that we've got a couple of group folders here, rather than just straight layers. And those are for example, the leg here. There inside the group is the boot top and the orange bit here. And they're grouped together because we really want to treat this really as one layer. But if we have the separate pieces, it doesn't hurt to group them. And again, they could be grouped here as they are in Photoshop, or we could wait and pre-compose them in After Effects. Once again, it really doesn't matter, and we're going to be kind of showing you a bit of both. This is one of those things where one or the other, there's really not all that much pro and con on either side. So in this case, these guys are combined together, and we also have the body, the clothing, which is really just these little black outlines, and the orange part are all separated here. And then all of the facial parts are all separated, of course. And the reason why we want to keep this separated and just group it or pre-compose it rather than merge this together is, once again, what if we decide we want to make a small change in this? Having these layers separate so we have just the orange and just those little outlines will make any edits so very much easier. So it's a really good idea, again, to try to keep things as separate as possible. And in this case, they're kind of grouped pretty close to probably what we'll do when we get into rigging, but we have the option always to pre-compose or even pull things out of a pre-comp if we want. It's all about giving yourself options and being able to be flexible so that you can retool something that maybe doesn't work like you hoped it would. We looked a little bit earlier at the orange man here, and he's set up very similar way to the orange lady with the line art detail separated from the orange, and he's got his body parts separated. And we looked a little bit about how his arms are jointed at the shoulder earlier on. He's another one where we're just going to puppet tool these arms and these legs, but we're going to do a little bit of jointing in the hands and in the feet potentially. These orange people and the two hipster characters we looked at earlier were all designed by Alex Pope, who also designed most of the characters for Character Animation Bootcamp. And she designed some vector characters that we're going to be looking at in a little bit as well. Now let's take a look at some characters on the other end of the spectrum stylistically. We have these sort of superhero kind of comic book characters. These super cool characters were designed by Jared Greenleaf. And you can see they've got a lot of detail. They're quite complex. And if you'll notice, all of the layers are grouped together here. And if we open the layers, you'll see that Jared sent these to us with outlines separated from color here to make editing, if necessary, a lot easier. And we've also got, in some cases, we've combined some groups up, like here at the torso, we've put the hips and the middle part of the torso and the neck together to make one torso layer there. And within the head here, we actually have the helmet separated from the head. Now, we could actually rig this so that the helmet could turn on and off, and having the helmet and the head layers already pre-composed together will work just fine for creating that kind of a rig. And again, if we ever needed to, we could always actually pull these layers apart in After Effects if we needed to. So generally, this is probably pretty close to what we'll use for the rigging setup. Now, you'll notice here that, again, if we open up this leg, we have the different parts, the thigh separated and the upper part of the boot and the knee pad. These are all separate. But generally, when we're doing a more realistic character like this, particularly one with so much detail in the artwork, jointing should probably be our last choice unless for some reason we need a really, really huge range of motion. If we don't need a big range of motion, working with the puppet tool for the most part is going to work better for characters with this level of detail. Now, one exception here will probably be his mechanical arm. That's going to make more sense to joint, to just work with layers and jointing, because it's mechanical and it doesn't want to squish and squash and deform. But the legs and this arm, for example, when we bend this knee, it would be almost impossible to create some kind of circular overlap that would really work as this knee bends to keep that artwork looking continuous. Same with the ankle here or the heel and toe roll. If you tried to cut this art and then tried to bend it, it would just look terrible. Now, in some cases, you may not have any other option if you need a very wide range of motion. But again, this is where negotiations and conversations with the client and their expectations and having as much control over design and story direction as possible, so that you can say, okay, with a character like this, we can't really do big, giant athletic movement, even though it's a kind of a superhero type character, unless we bring some of the detail down. And if we brought some of the detail down, it would become easier to create more flexible joints that would give us a larger range of motion. But we'll see when we get into rigging what we can get away with here. But generally, if you're dealing with something more realistic with a lot of detail, puppet tool is often going to be a really good choice. So that's what we're going to do for the most part here, and the layers are divided accordingly. We also have this really cool superhero woman who's got some wings, and we'll look at doing a simple rig setup for her wings. She's set up in very much the same way as the guy was. And this is a great example here. If we look at this arm, even though it is actually divided into pieces, it would be pretty tough, once again, to create an overlap that would allow you to bend this arm and maintain this beautiful detail and all the shading. Look at all that shading and all that stuff. Once again, the puppet tool is going to be the better choice here because it's going to allow us to flex that artwork. So in this case, once again, we're probably just going to work with these arms as single pieces, but again, we've jointed them at the shoulder. We're not going to joint the little hand. Notice that the hand is included in this layer here. And that's because if you look very carefully here, this character also has a long sleeve, sort of like our hipsters, and the sleeve is actually covering where the actual wrist joint would be, which would be about right here if we want this to bend realistically. Also, there's no room for this to bend because the sleeve is tight, so I can't really rotate that hand without it immediately poking out the side of the sleeve, and that wouldn't look very good at all. So we're most likely, again, going to want a puppet tool, and we'll put our puppet pin about right here so that'll bend, and we'll get that artwork continuous all the way through. And then we'll use starching to make it look clean and as if there is a skeletal structure underneath. And again, don't worry if some of the things I'm saying are going over your head or sounding like gobbledygook. Don't panic. As I said, in a certain sense, talking about prepping at this stage is a little putting the cart before the horse because we have to think about what we're going to do in the rigging when we're doing the prepping. But again, as you move through this course, all will become clear, I promise you. So this character is in good shape and is ready to go. Now that we've spent some time looking at some prepped characters in Photoshop, let's go ahead and take a look at some characters created in Illustrator. Here we have another great character designed by Alex Pope, this little farmer dude here. And he's a very typical kind of vector character, lots of geometry, nice flat, bright colors, really typical of the kind of vector graphic illustration that you're likely to see. And really, everything is pretty much the same as everything we went through in Photoshop. The naming conventions, the layers, the circular overlaps, which you can see there at the joints, the careful layering to make sure that this arm is on top of the torso and the head, and so forth and so on. All of those things are exactly the same. It's also set in a 6,000 by 6,000 artboard. But because this character is 100% vector, I could have built him smaller and then taken advantage of the infinite scalability of vector artwork to blow him up to any size I want. But always remember that if you end up including any raster elements at all, like a raster texture or a photo collage element mixed with your vector art, you'll need to work at a large scale with high-resolution raster images just like a fully raster-based character. Now, one significant difference between Illustrator and Photoshop that's worth talking about is the difference between Illustrator layers and sublayers and Photoshop groups. We looked at a few characters that had groups in them, and as we talked about, when you import a Photoshop file with a group in it, it turns that group into a pre-comp, which is very handy in many cases for the rigging process. But Illustrator layers are different. The significant thing is that when you import an Illustrator file into After Effects, After Effects will only recognize the topmost layer. It will not recognize any sublayers at all. It will not see a layer that has multiple sublayers within it as a pre-comp. It will just simply see it as a single flattened, essentially, layer. Now you can take a vector layer imported from Illustrator and you can have it converted into shape layers in After Effects. It's not a seamless process, and most likely if you're not comfortable working with shape layers, you're not going to really want to work with them as shape layers anyway. So if you need something separate and editable within After Effects, make sure and make a separate layer for it. Now we have sublayers in this file. I was just showing you some in the body layer here, but these are not layers that I need to have any access to in After Effects. I'm totally fine if I need to do any editing. I'm perfectly fine coming back into Illustrator and doing the editing in Illustrator and then going back to After Effects. And that's a significant difference from Photoshop, where basically what you see is what you get in Photoshop. The groups become pre-comps, and the layers inside the pre-comps are going to look exactly like the layers in Photoshop. So in Illustrator, we have to just remember that everything that we want to fiddle with or rig or deal with as a separate element, we need to make sure it is in a separate layer, not sublayer. Very, very important. It'll save you a lot of time and trouble. So you can see we've got all of our layers there, and we don't have, for example, all the face stuff all grouped into one layer, because again, then we wouldn't be able to animate them and rig up the face. Now again, just like the Photoshop files, we have circular overlaps at all the joints, and we've also got an outlined version of the character, and you can see that we've got the same setup that we looked at with the raster character in Photoshop, where the arm layer that is on top has the outline that stops at the midway point of the circular overlap, and the layer underneath that, in this case the upper arm, and remember it could be upper or lower, it doesn't particularly matter which direction you go, has the outline all the way around. And then again, when we rotate this, that line, if it's done very precisely, will connect with the elbow's outline and will have a seamless outline with that jointed arm. It's also interesting to note here that once we added outlines to this, we had to break the kind of general rule you would use for a character in sort of a three-quarter posture, with having the front leg be in front of the torso, because in this case we couldn't really do that and keep the outline style looking nice. So both of the leg and feet combinations are both behind the torso, but the arms, torso and head, and the other arm are stacked the same as we looked at with the three-quarter character in Photoshop. As we move through the course, we'll also work with this lovely lady. This is the farmer's wife. She's set up very similarly to all of our other characters. She just has little mitten hands that'll be fun and cute when that is rigged and animated. And her layers are set up the same way we looked at with the other characters who are in the front view. The arms are above the torso and the head, and the legs are above the torso sitting on that bottom layer. And she, of course, has her markers, too, for her overlapping joints. Then, in a different direction, style-wise, we have this stylish businessman here. This is a character we found on Shutterstock, and we have prepped him for animation. And one of your exercises after this lesson will be to take a very similar character that is in the original form it came from Shutterstock and turn it into a prepped riggable character. This guy is a three-quarter character, and you can see he's set up in the very similar way, except there's one difference in the layering here as well. This character merely has upper legs, and he doesn't actually have a pelvis. Now, I'm suspicious about this. I think we may need to put a pelvis in there, but I'm going to wait and see if we can get away without it. But in order to keep the bottom of his white shirt, his perfect businessman white shirt, nice and neat, we had to put the legs underneath the suit and the white shirt. So once again, in the ideal situation, this front-facing leg here in a three-quarter pose would actually be on top of the torso. It's just not possible with this particular character design. And that's the thing. You always have to be willing to give and compromise with the look and the design and the style of the character. It's just part of the game. It's pretty much always a question of making compromises between the appearance of the character and what it's going to have to do once it's rigged and animated. Now, another fun little feature of this character here is that he can hold and not hold a briefcase. We're going to rig that up later on. He can also hold and not hold a cell phone, and so he can talk on his cell phone, and we'll get that rigged up as well for this guy. And just to note some other little points about his overlapping joints, here's where his overlaps are. And I want you to notice, I'm going to turn the outlines are on here. And I want you to notice a really significant thing. Here's this circle for the shoulder. And here is the edge of the chest and the suit. Now the suit doesn't fill in all the way around this circular overlap. It doesn't have to. This arm is sitting on top, and so it's going to cover this whole area up no matter where the arm is positioned. But I want you to notice what is happening right here, because this was a significant adjustment both for this arm and for this arm, was to get this circle positioned so it just grazed the edge of this angle. When you do that, what's going to happen is as this rotates, we'll always have this clean connection here, and we won't have any little points poking out, revealing this kind of harsh edge here at the edge of the suit. Same with this side here. So this is a very important adjustment, and just nudging it back and forth changed the relationship really significantly in how this rotation would be able to either hide or not hide that little point there on the edge of the chest. So little things like that, really thinking through what's going to happen when that joint starts to rotate. What's the artwork going to do? What's going to be revealed underneath? How is that going to look? How is it going to interact with the lines and the artwork around it? Are all things that you have to consider. Now, as I've said numerous times now, a lot of this will make more sense once we get in and actually start rigging things. So let's go ahead and switch back to our regular view. We'll turn our markers off there. But there's one serious issue here. We've gained a nice flexible joint with a wide range of motion, but we have lost something of the original design of the character. And so let's take a look at the original character that we got from Shutterstock. Okay, so there he is, and you can see there is a significant difference in the shoulders. And these little sharp angled shoulders and the kind of slim cut of the jacket, it's really part of the style of this character. Now, if we zoom in here and look at this, this is before it was prepped in any way for rigging. But you can see there's a problem here. If we try to put circular overlaps with an arm hanging straight down here, that circle is going to bump up over the shoulder. And if I try to put a circle here and link that up with the arm, then I'm going to get a weird little bump here. So it's not really an ideal situation. I could leave the little bump on the arm and then have the circle in here, but that's going to look very strange, and we're going to have odd shapes and double bumps and things when that arm begins to rotate. So we've gained something by changing that and having the arms pulled lower down, but now we've lost that crisp edge that frankly is part of the look and style of this character. So we have to some degree corrupted this style in order to gain greater movement. And I'm doing this on purpose because this is a significant issue when you're rigging. You sometimes do have to make sacrifices. And the other thing is, sometimes the sacrifices won't fly. This might not get by an art director. I'm not sure if it would get by me. If I had approved this character, I'm not sure I would be okay with what's changed here. Now, in some ways, it's not that bad. He just looks a little more athletic. He looks a little, more like a swimmer than this guy does. But that's all right. We've definitely changed the kind of overall style, which is all sharp angles, though, because we've now introduced a curve, and we really don't have any other curves anywhere else on his body. So that's a significant sort of style corruption there. Now, if I didn't need a real wide range of motion, or I didn't mind a certain amount of mess or imperfection in the overlapping of the joint as it rotates, then you could probably find a nearly circular or somewhat ovular joint arrangement for this arm that would preserve the style and give you a pretty wide range of motion. In fact, you might get lucky and it might work perfectly 360 degrees. And I want to make that clear too. You're seeing me go through a prepping process here. I haven't gotten in and started to rig anything yet. And in some cases, I may be taking a precaution that may not actually have a payoff. But in my experience, I've learned to listen to that little voice in the back of my head that says, that might be a problem. If I hear a little something telling me that might be a problem, I pretty much put it on the list as a problem. Now, it may turn out to have not been a problem. And I'm sure I could find numerous times where I took a precaution that didn't pay off, that either I recognized later on and said, well, I guess I didn't really need to do that, but I did it anyway, or things that I never even noticed that I over-prepared for and just went by. But I'm willing to have done a little bit of overkill work here and there in order to have projects go more smoothly overall. I think it's a reasonable payoff for erring on the side of caution. So I decided to shift those arms down with that circular overlap to make 100% sure that at 360 degrees, that arm would look good and clean. Maybe not exactly in style, but it'll look clean and seamless, and it won't be distracting as it's animating. But there is one more solution that we haven't discussed, a more advanced rigging technique that would allow you to keep this exact style and get a good clean joint at 360 degrees. But again, that's advanced stuff, so we're going to save that for later. For now, we're sticking to basics. So for now, we're going to pretend that our art director is not paying that much attention and did not have a problem with us rounding out these shoulders in order that this character could get a really wide range of movement. Let's pretend this character has to be on screen for a long time and maybe has to run and jump and leap through a variety of infographics about the stock exchange or something. And so he's got to be pretty athletic and do a lot of different things. That is what we are prepping him and what we're going to be rigging him for. And then later on, we'll look at how we can fix this problem if you have an art director that is paying attention and busts you for this corruption of the style. Now that we've gone over prepping characters for rigging in After Effects, we can talk a little bit about the intersection of character design and rigging and animation in our next video.